My name is Mary, and I am 26 years old. For as long as I can remember, I have been the good daughter, the reliable one, the one my parents could point to when they wanted proof that they had done something right. Straight A's through school, a business degree with honors, and a job waiting for me at the family construction supply company before I'd even walked across the graduation stage. I started working there when I was 16, filing paperwork after school, learning inventory codes before I learned how to relax. By my early 20s, I knew the business inside and out, and by 26, I had convinced myself that loyalty was the same thing as love. My older sister was the opposite in every way, louder, messier, the kind of person who lived intensely and then dealt with consequences later, if at all. 3 years ago, she got engaged to the son of my parents' biggest supplier, and everyone pretended it was a love story, even though the truth was obvious. Her fiancé's family owned the manufacturing plant that supplied nearly half of our inventory at a steep discount. The engagement wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. A merger wrapped in an engagement ring. I didn't like it, but I didn't question it either. Questioning things wasn't my role. 8 months ago, that engagement imploded. My sister found out her fiancé had been sleeping with her college roommate for over a year. The fallout was ugly, real, and for once, justified. She moved back home, started therapy, cried in a way that wasn't performative. Whatever her faults, she was genuinely heartbroken. I supported her. I drove her to appointments, listened when she needed to vent, defended her when extended family whispered. That was what good daughters did. That was what good sisters did. What no one said out loud was that the business relationship between our families was now hanging by a thread. The supplier deal had always been contingent on family unity. When my sister ended the engagement, the other family made it clear they were reconsidering everything. No more discount pricing, no more priority shipping. Just like that, my parents' profit margins were at risk. I knew they were stressed, but stress was normal in our house. It didn't alarm me, not yet. 3 weeks ago, my mother invited me to Sunday dinner. She sounded cheerful, almost relieved. I didn't think twice. When I walked into their dining room, the smell of roast chicken in the air, I saw him sitting at the table, my sister's ex, calm, smug, looking at me like I was something he'd already evaluated and found acceptable. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up. "Honey," my mother said, clasping her hands together like she was about to announce a vacation, "we need to talk about the future of this family." My father didn't waste time. He laid everything out with the efficiency of a boardroom meeting. The supplier agreement, the financial fallout if it ended, the solution they had worked out with the other family. When my mother gestured toward my sister's ex and said, "He's willing to give you a chance," it took everything in me not to laugh, or scream, or run. "You want me to marry him," I said slowly, making sure I'd heard correctly. "The man who cheated on my sister." "People make mistakes," my father replied, already irritated. "What matters is the business." The business. I repeated the words in my head like they might change meaning if I stared at them long enough. My mother chimed in, saying I wasn't seeing anyone, that I was 26 and not getting any younger, that this was a good match. Wealthy family, attractive man, a fresh start. As if betrayal expired when it became inconvenient. The ex finally spoke, leaning back in his chair. "I always thought you were the smarter one anyway." I looked at my sister then. She sat in the corner of the room, staring at her hands, not meeting my eyes. That hurt more than anything else. Not anger, not shame, just absence. "No," I said. My mother's face tightened. "Excuse me?" "No," I repeated. "I'm not marrying him. I'm not marrying anyone to save your profit margins." My father sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Don't be dramatic. This is how business works. Families have done this for centuries." "This isn't the 1800s, I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. "I'm not a bargaining chip." I grabbed my purse and walked out. My mother followed me to the car, hissing about selfishness, about everything they had built, about how I was going to destroy the family. I drove away while she was still talking, hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles hurt. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the pressure has been relentless. Daily calls, endless texts. My mother showing up at my apartment just to talk. My father reminding me, casually at first, that my job at the company wasn't guaranteed, extended family members calling to explain how reasonable the arrangement actually was if I just thought about it properly. They all spoke like this was a negotiation, not a violation. Last Tuesday, it escalated. My parents called me to a formal meeting at their house. Both of them were there. So was their lawyer. Seeing him sitting at the table felt surreal, like I'd stepped into the wrong life. He explained my options in a calm, professional tone. If I didn't comply, I would be terminated immediately, removed from their will, required to repay my college tuition, which they now claimed had been a loan, cut off entirely. You have 1 week to decide, my father said. Think carefully. I looked at them, really looked, and felt something inside me shift. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. They had forgotten something important. I had been inside that company for 10 years. I knew things. Things I had ignored out of loyalty, out of habit, out of fear of what would happen if I stopped being useful. You have 1 week, my father repeated. So do you, I said, standing up. I don't think they understood what I meant. Not yet. I walked out knowing, for the first time in my life, that being the good daughter had finally run its course. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying the meeting in slow motion. The lawyer's calm voice, my mother's fixed smile, my father's certainty that fear would bring me back in line. By morning, my phone was already buzzing. Missed calls, voicemails, messages layered with guilt, urgency, and irritation. They weren't asking anymore. They were managing me. My mother showed up at my apartment that afternoon without warning. She stood in the doorway like she owned the place, eyes scanning my living room as if assessing damage. We need to talk like adults, she said. I told her I was at work. She ignored that. She talked about reputation, about how the other family was waiting, about how my sister was fragile, and how I was strong enough to handle this. That was always the argument. I was strong, so I should bend. I was capable, so I should sacrifice. When I told her no again, her voice sharpened. You're being selfish, she said. You don't understand what you're risking. I looked at her and realized she wasn't worried about me at all. She was worried about margins. The calls didn't stop. My father left voicemails reminding me how much they'd invested in me. My aunt called to say I was breaking my mother's heart. A cousin texted that I should at least hear the guy out. Everyone spoke as if I were rejecting a job offer, not a man who had already proven what kind of husband he would be. Every conversation carried the same message: fall in line or pay the price. Pay. At work, the atmosphere changed. Conversations went quiet when I entered rooms. My access to certain accounts was suddenly limited. My father stopped copying me on emails I'd handled for years. It wasn't subtle. It was punishment disguised as professionalism. By Friday, I knew the formal meeting hadn't been a bluff. They were preparing to erase me. When they summoned me again, I went because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. The lawyer was there again, papers neatly stacked in front of him. This time, he laid out the consequences clearly: immediate termination, removal from the will, a demand for repayment of my college tuition, framed as an undocumented family loan, complete severance from the family if I didn't agree to pursue an engagement within 6 months. You're choosing pride over family, my father said, his voice tight. I'm choosing autonomy, I replied. My mother leaned forward, eyes hard. You think you can just walk away from us? From everything we gave you? That was the moment something cracked open. Not anger, understanding. Everything they gave me had come with strings, with expectations, with an invoice I was only seeing now. I realized then that their love had always been conditional. I was valuable as long as I was useful, replaceable the moment I wasn't. You have 1 week, my father said again, like repetition would make it true. I looked at him, then at my mother, then at the lawyer who wouldn't meet my eyes. So do you, I said. They stared at me like I was bluffing, like I was still the girl who followed rules, who absorbed pressure quietly, who cleaned up messes she didn't make. I didn't explain. I didn't threaten. I stood up, gathered my things, and walked out while my mother called my name behind me, her voice sharp with something that sounded almost like panic. That night I didn't cry. I opened my laptop. I started with what I knew. Bank statements I'd copied years ago when numbers didn't line up. screenshots of bookkeeping entries that never made it into tax filings, receipts for equipment written off as business expenses that I recognized from my parents' vacation home garage, records of rental income that had never been reported. I organized everything carefully, methodically, the way I'd always handled work. Loyalty had kept me silent. Threats had set me free. By dawn, the decision was already made. They thought the worst thing they could do was fire me, disown me, and erase me from their future. They had no idea they'd just handed me clarity. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and for the first time, I wasn't going to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. The good daughter was done negotiating. By the time the sun came up, my apartment looked like a crime scene made of paper. Printouts covered the dining table. Folders were stacked in neat, color-coded piles on the floor. My laptop hummed softly, tabs open to spreadsheets I had helped build years ago and never questioned closely enough. It was strange how calm I felt. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural, almost boring in its precision. That scared me more than anger ever could. I had known about the irregularities for years. Not the full scope, not at first, but enough to recognize patterns that didn't sit right. Cash payments that never quite made it into the final reports. Consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist beyond a mailing address. Equipment written off as business expenses that somehow ended up stored at my parents' vacation home. Rental properties that generated income no one talked about during tax season. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I was protecting the family. I told myself this was how successful people operated and that my discomfort was naive. Handling the books had been my father's idea. 3 years ago, he decided he didn't trust outsiders with the finances. He trusted me. Or maybe he trusted my silence. I had access to everything, every account, every adjustment, every conveniently timed expense. Looking at it all now, laid out in front of me, I felt a cold, heavy clarity settle in. This wasn't a gray area. This was sustained, deliberate fraud. I thought about the night at the dinner table, the way they spoke about me like a solution, the lawyer, the threats, the assumption that fear would keep me compliant the way loyalty always had. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had erased it completely. Filing the report took less time than I expected. IRS Form 211. Name, evidence, documentation, conservative estimates of unreported income. I attached everything I had, triple-checking each file before uploading it. When I hit submit, there was no dramatic rush, no satisfaction, just finality. I reported them to the State Department of Revenue that same morning. If I was doing this, I was doing it fully. Then I hired a lawyer. She was direct, calm, and completely unimpressed by my parents' threats. She reviewed the so-called tuition loan claim and laughed without humor. No promissory note, no repayment terms, no documentation. "That's a gift," she said. "They're bluffing." We discussed my employment situation, wrongful termination, unemployment eligibility. She advised me to document everything from this point forward, every call, every text, every unannounced visit. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The week deadline passed quietly. My parents called, furious that I hadn't come to my senses. My father officially fired me over the phone, his voice tight and rehearsed. I thanked him for confirming it in writing and hung up. Thanks to my lawyer, I filed for unemployment the same day. 4 days later, the real consequences arrived. The IRS showed up at the company. 5 people in suits. Filing cabinets opened. Computers accessed. My cousin, who still worked in the warehouse, texted me in a panic. "There are people everywhere. Dad is losing it. What did you do?" I didn't reply. 2 days after that, the State Revenue Department sent their own audit notice. My parents lost control of the narrative instantly. My mother showed up at my apartment at 7 in the morning, pounding on the door like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she stormed inside, face flushed, hands shaking. "What did you do?" she demanded. "The IRS is crawling through our business. Someone reported us. Someone who knew things." She stared at me, eyes narrowing. "Was it you?" I didn't answer. "After everything we'd done for you," she screamed. "Raising you, paying for your education, giving you a job. This is how you repay us?" I told her exactly why I did it. Not loudly, not emotionally. I told her they had tried to sell me to my sister's cheating ex, that they threatened to destroy my life when I refused, that they taught me money mattered more than people, and I had finally believed them. That's business, she snapped. That's how the world works. You think love matters more than money? Grow up. Then she told me to fix it, to call the IRS, to say it was a mistake, to lie. That's not how this works, I said. Even if I wanted to, which I don't, they'd still investigate. Her face went pale, then red again. You're not my daughter anymore, she said. You're dead to us. She left, slamming the door hard enough to crack the frame. 2 days later, I found out they'd hired a criminal defense attorney. Not a tax lawyer, a criminal one. That was when I understood just how serious this was. My father tried a different approach. He called me late one night, voice calm, almost gentle. He talked about family, about cooling off, about helping them explain things to investigators. I asked him directly if he was asking me to lie to federal agents. He didn't answer. Instead, he reminded me who put food on my table, who made me who I was. The person you made me is someone who can't be bought, I said. Guess you should have made me greedier. He hung up. My sister finally reached out after that. A single text, accusatory, emotional, telling me I was destroying the family, that mom wasn't sleeping, that dad was falling apart. I replied with the truth, plainly stated. She minimized it, called it exaggeration, called it a solution. I asked her where her self-respect was if she thought this was acceptable. She didn't respond. The audits continued, the pressure intensified, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized something irreversible had happened. I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, I had already crossed the point of no return. Once the audits began, the family stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. Panic replaced control, and blame became their language of choice. My parents' lawyer advised them not to contact me, but that lasted exactly 1 day. Calls came from blocked numbers. Texts arrived from relatives I barely spoke to. Every message carried the same undertone. Fix this. Make it stop. Come back and clean up the mess you started. It was almost impressive how quickly responsibility shifted from the people who committed the fraud to the person who refused to lie about it. My mother showed up again, this time quieter, almost unrecognizable. Her voice trembled as she talked about stress, about losing sleep, about how the investigators were asking questions she couldn't answer. When fear didn't work, she tried nostalgia. Stories from my childhood, sacrifices they made, all of it framed as debt I owed. When that failed, anger came roaring back. She accused me of betrayal, of destroying my own blood for money, of being heartless. I listened until she ran out of words. Then I asked her one question. At what point did you think forcing me to marry a man who cheated on my sister was loving? She had no answer. She left without another word. The extended family fractured under the weight of the truth. Some believed my parents' version completely, the one where I was an ungrateful daughter who misunderstood a generous opportunity. Others started asking uncomfortable questions once the audits became public knowledge. A few reached out quietly, apologetically, admitting they'd suspected something was wrong for years but never thought it was their place to say anything. Neutrality became a survival strategy for many. No one wanted to be the next target. My sister called again, her tone different this time, not angry, scared. She told me our parents might have to sell the house we grew up in, that they were using it as collateral for legal fees. She asked me how I could live with that. I told her I wasn't the one who committed federal crimes for over a decade. I reminded her of the dinner, the lawyer, the threats. She said I could have just walked away. I told her I tried. They wouldn't let me. Silence stretched between us, heavy and unresolved, and then she hung up. Meanwhile, the business started to unravel. Accounts were frozen. Vendors hesitated. Clients asked questions. My parents couldn't answer. The accountant who had quietly helped keep the books creative for years decided self-preservation mattered more than loyalty. He began cooperating with investigators, handing over records that went back even further than mine. That was when the numbers stopped being abstract. Millions in unreported income. Years of deliberate deception. There was no spin left that could make this look accidental. Legal threats followed. A cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation and interference arrived at my door in an official-looking envelope. My lawyer responded with 2 pages of calm, devastating clarity. Everything reported was true. Reporting crimes to authorities was protected. Harassment needed to stop. The response from their side was silence, but the family pressure resumed almost immediately. An aunt called, voice dripping with disappointment, asking how I could do this to my own parents. I repeated the truth. She said that wasn't how they told it. I told her I was sure it wasn't. The final straw came when my sister's ex showed up at the company unannounced, trying to help smooth things over. The supplier deal he represented was already collapsing, and his irritation was palpable. He blamed me openly for ruining an arrangement that had never involved my consent. Hearing about it later, I felt something close to vindication. The very man they wanted to trade me to was now angry that the transaction failed. As weeks passed, my parents' control slipped completely. They weren't managing outcomes anymore. They were reacting, hiring and firing lawyers, scrambling to refinance assets, watching the legacy they cared about crumble in real time. And through it all, they never apologized. Not once. Not for the threats. Not for the coercion. Not for reducing their daughter to leverage. What surprised me most wasn't how ugly it got. It was how clearly I could see it now. Every manipulation, every condition, every time love had been dangled like a reward instead of given freely. The family I thought I was protecting had never existed the way I imagined. It had always been transactional. I had just been too useful to notice. By the time the auditors finished their preliminary findings, there was nothing left to argue about. The truth was documented, quantified, and irreversible. The only thing left was fallout. And for the first time, I wasn't standing in the middle of it, trying to absorb the damage for everyone else. I was standing outside, watching the illusion finally collapse. 4 months later, the investigation ended. Not quietly, not gently. It ended with numbers so large they stopped feeling real. The IRS assessed my parents more than $2.3 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. The state followed with another $340,000. The conservative estimate I had submitted turned out to be exactly that, conservative. Between unreported cash income, fake consulting invoices, personal expenses disguised as business costs, and rental income quietly omitted year after year, the actual amount of fraud stretched back more than a decade. Criminal charges were considered. That part matters. They were not declined because my parents were innocent. They were declined because the government determined that civil penalties would recover the money more efficiently. They got lucky. Very lucky. Luck they never acknowledged. What $2.6 million of sudden debt does to a family business is simple. It destroys it. Not dramatically, methodically. My parents couldn't get a buyer willing to absorb the liability, so they sold the company in pieces. Inventory first, then contracts, then equipment. Clients scattered. The business my grandfather built and my father ran for 40 years was gone in 6 months. The supplier deal that started this entire nightmare died quietly when the other family cut ties, unwilling to be associated with a scandal. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so devastating. The house went next, the one I grew up in, the one where I learned to ride a bike, had my first heartbreak, believed I was safe, sold to cover legal fees and part of the tax debt. My parents moved into a rented condo. My mother sold her car. My father, 63 years old and unemployed for the first time since his early 20s, started looking for work. I heard all of this secondhand. They never told me themselves. My sister's ex got engaged to someone else 3 months later. The entire arrangement my parents were willing to destroy their daughter over was never going to work anyway. That detail landed harder than I expected. Am I happy about what happened to them? No. I'm not a monster. Watching your parents lose everything they worked for hurts, even when you understand why it happened. But guilt and responsibility are not the same thing. They made choices. For years, they chose fraud. They chose coercion. They chose money over their child. I didn't make those choices. I just stopped shielding them from consequences. The whistleblower award came through last week. Because the government recovered over $2 million based on my information, I'm entitled to a percentage. The exact figure is still being finalized, but my lawyer estimates between $300,000 and $400,000. Some people would call it blood money, money earned by betraying family. I see it differently. I see it as severance pay for a role I never consented to. The good daughter, the fixer, the one who absorbed damage so everyone else could stay comfortable. I got a new job, senior operations manager at a larger construction supply company. Better pay, better benefits, a boss who knows my entire story because I told him during the interview. He listened, then said something I didn't expect. Anyone with the integrity to report fraud, even against their own family, is someone I want on my team. I cried in my car afterward, quietly, from relief. My parents haven't spoken to me since their lawyer told them to stop contacting me. My sister sends occasional messages heavy with guilt and nostalgia. I don't respond. Extended family has mostly written me off, except for a few cousins who reached out privately to say they understood. I'm okay with that. Being alone is easier than being used. Last week, I ran into my sister's ex at a coffee shop, completely by accident. He smirked when he saw me, made a comment about karma, about how none of this would have happened if I'd just said yes. I laughed, not bitterly, honestly. I told him he wasn't a prize. He was a warning. Then I walked out without looking back. I drive past my parents' old house sometimes, not on purpose. It's on the way to work. Every time I see it, I think about the girl who grew up there, the one who thought love was earned through sacrifice, the one who believed if she just did enough, gave enough, endured enough, she'd finally be chosen. She doesn't exist anymore. I let her go the night I filed that report. In her place is someone different, someone who knows that loyalty, without reciprocity, is a trap, someone who understands that being a good daughter to bad parents isn't virtue. It's a cage, and I finally unlocked it. I don't owe anyone anything anymore, not explanations, not apologies, not my future. And for the first time in my life, that freedom feels priceless.